In June 1942, as America reeled from Pearl Harbor and the Pacific seemed lost, Japanese forces launched an audacious invasion of American soil, landing troops on the Aleutian Islands of Alaska in a campaign that would prove to be one of their greatest strategic blunders. What followed was 15 months of brutal combat in conditions so harsh that the weather killed more men than bullets, exposing fatal flaws in Japanese planning and demonstrating American resilience in the most unforgiving environment on Earth.
The Northern Gambit. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, conceived the Aleutian invasion as part of a larger operation to draw American naval forces away from Midway Island, where Japan planned to destroy the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet in a decisive battle. The plan called for Japanese forces to occupy the western Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, establishing bases that could threaten the American mainland and potentially support a future invasion of the continental United States. The strategic logic was flawed from the beginning. The Aleutian Islands stretch more than 1,200 miles west from the Alaska Peninsula into the North Pacific, forming a chain of volcanic peaks shrouded in perpetual fog, battered by violent storms, and subjected to some of the most brutal weather conditions on the planet. The islands offered no resources worth exploiting. Their harbors were icebound for much of the year, and their strategic value was questionable at best. Yet Japanese military planners, intoxicated by their early war successes and convinced of American weakness, pushed forward with an operation that would ultimately prove catastrophic. The invasion force departed Japan in late May 1942, comprising two small carrier groups, several cruisers and destroyers, and transport ships carrying approximately 8,500 troops. The plan called for diversionary airstrikes against Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, followed by landings on Attu and Kiska. Japanese intelligence about the Aleutians was woefully inadequate. Their maps were inaccurate, their understanding of weather conditions superficial, and they had virtually no knowledge of the terrain they would be fighting across. The American position in the Aleutians was only marginally better. Colonel Simon Bolival Buckner, Jr., commanding Alaska Defense Command, had been warning about the vulnerability of Alaska to Japanese attack since before Pearl Harbor, but Alaska remained a backwater in American strategic planning. The Aleutians were defended by scattered Army units, a handful of obsolete aircraft, and naval forces that were laughably inadequate for the vast distances involved. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Kastner, commanding a small garrison on Unalaska, stood on the dock at Dutch Harbor on June 3, 1942, watching storm clouds gather over the harbor. A career Army officer who had served in Alaska for 3 years, Kastner understood the Aleutians in ways that few officers did. He knew the weather could change from clear to zero visibility in minutes. He knew that fog could blanket entire islands for weeks at a time. He knew that the combination of cold, damp, and wind could incapacitate soldiers faster than enemy fire. "If the Japanese come here," he told his executive officer, Captain Robert Thompson, "they're going to get a lesson in why Alaska is called the last frontier. This place doesn't care what flag you're flying. It will kill Japanese just as efficiently as it kills Americans." Thompson nodded, but his attention was on more immediate concerns. "Intelligence says Japanese carriers are approaching. We could be hit within hours. Our defenses are inadequate, a few anti-aircraft guns, no fighters immediately available, and harbor facilities that are wide open to air attack." The Japanese struck Dutch Harbor on June 3 with carrier-based aircraft, catching the Americans by surprise despite warnings from intelligence sources. The attack caused significant damage, destroying fuel tanks, damaging ships, and killing approximately 43 American servicemen. But it also revealed critical weaknesses in Japanese planning. Poor weather limited the effectiveness of the attack. Japanese pilots struggled to navigate in the fog and low clouds, and American anti-aircraft fire proved more effective than expected. More critically, the diversion failed to achieve its strategic objective. American naval commanders, already aware of Japanese plans for Midway through signals intelligence, did not divert forces to the Aleutians. The Japanese carrier groups that attacked Dutch Harbor were therefore wasted on a secondary operation while the main Japanese fleet sailed toward disaster at Midway. On June 7th, as the Battle of Midway reached its climax with the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers, Japanese forces landed unopposed on Attu and Kiska. The landings were anticlimactic. Attu's only inhabitants were 45 Aleut natives and an American couple operating a weather station, all of whom were captured. Kiska was completely uninhabited. The Japanese had successfully occupied American territory, but they had done so at tremendous cost elsewhere, and they had gained islands of dubious strategic value.
The fog of war. The Japanese occupation forces that landed on Attu and Kiska in June 1942 were woefully unprepared for the environment they were entering. The troops, most drawn from units that had been fighting in the tropics or temperate climates, had no cold weather training, inadequate clothing and equipment, and no experience with the unique challenges of Arctic warfare. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, commanding the Japanese garrison on Attu, recognized the severity of their situation within days of landing. His force of approximately 2,500 men was tasked with constructing defensive positions, building facilities for a permanent garrison, and preparing for the American counterattack that would inevitably come. But the environment itself was the first enemy they had to overcome. The temperature on Attu rarely rose above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in summer, and winter temperatures plunged well below zero. The constant wind, often reaching gale force, created wind chill factors that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Fog shrouded the island for days at a time, reducing visibility to a few yards. The ground was tundra, spongy, waterlogged terrain that turned to deep mud in summer and concrete hard frozen earth in winter. There were no trees, no shelter from the wind, and no indigenous food sources. Japanese soldiers, many still wearing tropical uniforms, supplemented with whatever cold weather gear could be scrounged, began suffering from exposure almost immediately. Frostbite became epidemic, with men losing fingers, toes, and in severe cases, entire limbs to the cold. Trenchfoot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, affected nearly every soldier. Respiratory infections spread rapidly through the crowded, poorly ventilated bunkers the Japanese constructed. The logistics situation was catastrophic. Supply ships from Japan had to travel thousands of miles through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines and aircraft. The few ships that made it through brought inadequate supplies, not enough food, not enough fuel, not enough medicine, not enough of anything needed to sustain a garrison in such a hostile environment. Japanese soldiers on Attu and Kiska began to starve. Their rations reduced to a few hundred calories per day, barely enough to sustain life in the Arctic cold. "This place is hell," a Japanese soldier wrote in his diary, found later by American forces. "We are cold all the time, hungry all the time, sick all the time. Men are dying not from enemy fire, but from this terrible land. Why are we here? What purpose does holding these frozen rocks serve? We are being sacrificed for nothing." The Americans, meanwhile, were building up forces for a counter-offensive. Alaska Defense Command was reinforced with additional Army units, modern aircraft, and naval forces. More importantly, the Americans began learning how to fight in Arctic conditions, developing cold weather equipment, training soldiers in Arctic survival, and studying the unique tactical challenges of combat in the Aleutians. Buckner, promoted to Major General and given expanded authority over operations in Alaska, understood that recapturing the occupied islands would require careful preparation.
A hasty assault against prepared Japanese positions in such difficult terrain would result in catastrophic casualties. Instead, he advocated for a methodical approach, establishing bases closer to the occupied islands, conducting reconnaissance to understand Japanese dispositions, and training troops specifically for the conditions they would face. The first major American operation came in August 1942, when forces landed on Adak Island, only 250 miles from Japanese-held Kiska. The landing was unopposed. The island was uninhabited, but it provided a forward base for air operations and a staging point for future operations. Engineers immediately began constructing airfields, despite weather that made construction work nearly impossible. Bulldozers bogged down in tundra, equipment froze and broke, and workers battled winds that could literally blow men off their feet. But the work continued, and by September, American aircraft were operating from Adak, conducting bombing raids on Japanese positions on Kiska and Attu. The raids were limited in effectiveness. Fog and storms often prevented aircraft from even finding their targets, but they imposed additional strain on already stressed Japanese garrisons.
The Battle for Attu. By spring 1943, after months of planning and preparation, American forces were ready to retake Attu. The operation, codenamed Operation Land Crab, called for an amphibious assault by approximately 11,000 American troops against the Japanese garrison of 2,500. The numerical advantage seemed overwhelming, but commanders knew that attacking prepared defensive positions in Arctic terrain would be extraordinarily difficult. The assault began on May 11, 1943, with American forces landing at two locations on opposite sides of the island, planning to converge on the Japanese positions in the center. The landings themselves were chaotic. Heavy surf capsized landing craft, equipment was lost overboard, and soldiers struggled ashore soaking wet in near-freezing temperatures. But the landings were unopposed. The Japanese had concentrated their forces inland, ceding the beaches in favor of defending the high ground. Major General Albert Brown, commanding the assault force, quickly realized that his intelligence about Attu had been dangerously inadequate. The terrain was far worse than anticipated. Steep mountains, deep valleys filled with snow and ice, and tundra that turned to knee-deep mud under the weight of soldiers and equipment. Movement was exhausting. Men took hours to advance distances that would have taken minutes on normal terrain. Wheeled vehicles were useless, and even tracked vehicles struggled. The Japanese, dug into positions on the high ground, had clear fields of fire over the American approaches. They had spent months preparing their defenses. Extensive bunker systems, interlocking machine gun positions, pre-registered mortar and artillery targets. Despite their suffering from cold and hunger, the Japanese soldiers fought with desperate determination, knowing that surrender was not an option in their military culture. The battle devolved into a brutal slog, with American forces advancing yard by yard against fanatical Japanese resistance. The cold was as much an enemy as Japanese bullets. Soldiers suffered from frostbite and hypothermia even while engaged in combat. Weapons froze and malfunctioned. Medical evacuation was nearly impossible due to the terrain and weather. Casualties mounted steadily, with Americans suffering more casualties from cold-related injuries than from enemy fire. Colonel Frank Cullen, commanding the 7th Infantry Division's assault elements, watched his regiment being ground down by the combination of enemy resistance and environmental conditions. We're losing more men to the cold than to the Japanese. We need better cold weather equipment, more medical support, and realistic expectations about how long this is going to take. We're not going to just walk over these Japanese positions. The battle for Attu continued for 18 days, far longer than planners had anticipated. American forces gradually compressed the Japanese perimeter, using superior firepower,
naval gunfire, artillery, and airstrikes when weather permitted, to blast Japanese positions. But each position had to be taken individually, often in close combat, with Japanese soldiers fighting to the death rather than surrendering. By May 29th, Colonel Yamazaki's garrison had been compressed into a small pocket, out of food, nearly out of ammunition, and facing inevitable defeat. Rather than surrender, Yamazaki organized a final banzai charge, a desperate attack that Japanese military doctrine prescribed when all else had failed. Approximately 800 Japanese soldiers launched themselves at American positions in the early morning hours of May 29th, many armed only with bayonets or makeshift weapons. The banzai charge penetrated American lines, overrunning several positions and causing significant casualties before being stopped by concentrated fire. When the sun rose on May 30th, the battlefield was littered with Japanese dead. Only 28 Japanese soldiers survived to be taken prisoner. The rest of the garrison had died fighting or committed suicide. American casualties totaled 549 killed and more than 1,100 wounded, a casualty rate of nearly 15% despite overwhelming numerical and material superiority.
The Ghost of Kiska. With Attu secured, American attention turned to Kiska, where approximately 5,000 Japanese soldiers remained in occupation. Intelligence suggested that Kiska was more heavily defended than Attu had been, with more elaborate fortifications and more troops. American planners anticipated that the battle for Kiska would be even more difficult and costly than Attu had been. What American intelligence failed to realize was that the Japanese had already decided to evacuate Kiska. The loss of Attu, combined with the impossibility of adequately supplying their isolated garrisons, had convinced Japanese naval commanders that the Aleutian occupation was unsustainable. In a brilliantly executed operation conducted under cover of fog on July 28, 1943, Japanese ships evacuated the entire Kiska garrison without American forces detecting the operation. American forces, unaware of the evacuation, proceeded with plans for a major assault. On August 15, 1943, approximately 34,000 American and Canadian troops landed on Kiska, expecting to face determined Japanese resistance. Instead, they found abandoned positions, booby traps, and no living Japanese soldiers. The landing itself proved more dangerous than any Japanese resistance would have been. In the fog and confusion, American and Canadian units mistook each other for Japanese forces and engaged in several friendly fire incidents. More than 300 Allied casualties resulted from these incidents, along with losses from booby traps and accidents in the treacherous terrain. The entire operation was a humiliating anticlimax. A massive force deployed against an enemy that wasn't there, suffering casualties from its own confusion. The Battle of Kiska became a dark joke among soldiers who participated, the battle where the only enemy was the weather and their own incompetence. But it also highlighted the unique challenges of operations in the Aleutians, where environmental conditions were so extreme that even unopposed operations resulted in significant casualties.
The strategic failure. The Japanese invasion and occupation of Attu and Kiska, viewed from any strategic perspective, was a comprehensive failure. The operation consumed significant resources, ships, aircraft, supplies, and thousands of soldiers for no meaningful gain. The occupied islands provided no strategic advantage. They could not support offensive operations against the American mainland, could not interdict Allied shipping routes effectively, and could not be sustained logistically. The casualties were staggering relative to any benefit achieved. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers died in the Aleutians, most not from combat but from disease, starvation, and exposure. The few hundred Americans who died directly from Japanese action were outnumbered by those who died from environmental causes. Both sides lost aircraft, ships, and equipment to the brutal conditions. Most critically, The operation diverted Japanese resources from theaters where they might have made a difference. The troops committed to the Aleutians could have been used in the Solomon Islands or New Guinea, where desperate battles were being fought in 1942-1943. The naval forces tied up supporting the Aleutian garrisons were unavailable for operations elsewhere. The supplies consumed in futile attempts to sustain isolated garrisons in the Arctic were desperately needed in other theaters. For the Americans, the campaign was ultimately a success, but an expensive one. They recaptured American territory and demonstrated that they could project power even in the most difficult environments. They gained valuable experience in cold weather operations that would prove useful in later conflicts. And they denied Japan 80 foothold on the North American continent, however marginal that foothold had been. But the cost, nearly 1,500 American dead, thousands more wounded or disabled by cold-related injuries, seemed disproportionate to the island's limited strategic value. Some military historians have argued that the Aleutians should have been blockaded and bypassed, allowing the Japanese garrisons to wither on the vine, rather than conducting costly assault operations.
Lessons written in ice. The Aleutian Campaign provided harsh lessons about the realities of Arctic warfare. Both sides learned that the environment itself was often more dangerous than the enemy, that logistics in such conditions were extraordinarily difficult, and that standard military doctrines developed for temperate climates didn't apply in the Arctic. The Americans, to their credit, studied these lessons systematically. They developed improved cold weather clothing and equipment, created doctrine for Arctic operations, and trained units specifically for cold weather combat. These developments would prove valuable in later conflicts, from Korea to Cold War operations in Alaska and the Arctic. The Japanese, defeated and desperate by 1943-1944, had neither the time nor resources to apply lessons learned in the Aleutians. The campaign became a footnote in their broader defeat, rarely mentioned in Japanese military histories except as an example of strategic overreach and inadequate preparation. For the Aleut people, native inhabitants of the islands, the war was catastrophic. Those captured by the Japanese on Attu were transported to Japan, where many died in captivity. Those living on other islands were forcibly evacuated by American authorities to camps in southeast Alaska, where conditions were often little better than imprisonment. Many died from disease in the camps, and when survivors were finally allowed to return to their islands after the war, they found their villages had been destroyed or abandoned. The islands themselves bear scars from the war even today. Rusting equipment, collapsed bunkers, and unexploded ordnance litter the landscapes of Attu and Kiska. The weather continues to be as brutal and unforgiving as it was in 1943-1943. A reminder that some battlefields remain hostile long after the fighting ends.
The forgotten theater. The Aleutian Campaign has largely been forgotten in American popular memory, overshadowed by more dramatic operations in the Pacific and Europe. Few Americans today could locate Attu or Kiska on a map, and fewer still know that these islands were occupied by Japanese forces for more than a year. Yet the campaign deserves to be remembered, if only for the lessons it provides about the importance of matching strategy to capability, the dangers of operations in extreme environments, and the resilience of soldiers who fought in some of the worst conditions imaginable. The Japanese failure in the Aleutians resulted from fundamental strategic misjudgment, compounded by inadequate preparation and logistics. They occupied territory they couldn't defend, supply, or use for any meaningful purpose. They committed forces to a secondary theater while losing decisive battles elsewhere. And they failed to understand that the Arctic environment would prove as formidable an opponent as any human enemy. The American success, such as it was, came from superior resources, better logistics, and a willingness to learn from experience and adapt. American forces suffered terribly in the Aleutians, but they persisted, improved their capabilities, and ultimately prevailed through a combination of material superiority and determination. Today, the Aleutian Islands remain remote and sparsely populated, much as they were before the war. The military bases built during the conflict have largely been abandoned, though Alaska remains strategically important as tensions rise in the Arctic due to climate change and great power competition. The lessons of 1942-1943 about the challenges of operating in extreme environments, the importance of adequate preparation and logistics, and the costs of strategic overreach remain relevant as nations contemplate their Arctic strategies in the 21st century. The soldiers who fought in the Aleutians, both American and Japanese, endured conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Many died, not in glorious combat, but from cold, disease, and the simple failure of their bodies to withstand the environment. Their sacrifice, in pursuit of strategic objectives that now seem questionable at best, serves as a reminder that war's costs extend far beyond the battlefield, and that some victories are so expensive they hardly seem worth the price paid to achieve them.